Welcome to Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History Hit. This is the place to explore the rich stories from the past that bring the world of Assassin's Creed to life. I'm Matt Lewis. Join me as we travel across the mysterious sands of ancient Egypt. Assassin's Creed Origins takes us back to 47 BCE, when Cleopatra fought for control of the Egyptian kingdom and forged an alliance with Julius Caesar in the chambers of her palace in Alexandria. Just like the pyramids, the people and places of this turning point in history remain mysterious. In this episode, Professor Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones will shed light on Cleopatra's oft-forgotten brother, Ptolemy XIII. Associate Professor Jen Gerrish will recount the fiery drama of Ptolemy's war with Caesar. And Dr Chris Naunton will take us on a tour of one of Egypt's greatest mysteries, the Sphinx. Let's dive into the echoes of history. I can't wait to find out more about the Sphinx as well, because I feel like it's one of those things that everybody knows about the Sphinx. Everybody kind of feels like they know what it looks like. Maybe it's something you could draw a picture of from memory, even if you've never seen it. It's kind of a fairly ubiquitous image. But just to start us off with, could you give us a description of what the Sphinx is and what it looks like, please?
Yes, it is essentially an enormous statue with a lion's body. It's a recumbent lion with four paws out on the ground in front, as it were, its hind legs tucked underneath it, and with the body of a human being wearing a particular kind of headdress, an Egyptian headdress which we call a nemes. And that is the sort of essence of the Egyptian Sphinx, if you like. They can have various different animals for bodies and various different heads, but lion plus human head is what we're looking at here. And the whole thing is an enormous sculpture cut from the natural rock, and it's weathered quite badly now in some places, and it's been rebuilt on a whole series of occasions from ancient times down to more or less the present day. So if you look closely, it's a bit of a mishmash of natural rock and blocks of limestone, but that's the essence of it.
So this isn't one of those occasions where people have bought tons and tons of stone to the spot to build it. It's actually carved from a piece of rock that was already there?
Yeah, it is, exactly. So the Egyptians were very capable of bringing huge pieces of stone fashioned into the images of the king or gods normally into position wherever they wanted them. But in this case, this is carved from the natural rock. So most probably this was at least partly a natural outcrop of rock, which from the off naturally had the shape of something, I suspect, and the Egyptians had the idea. They were quarrying around it actually for stone to build other things, and either from the beginning or at a certain way through that process, somebody realizes, oh look, maybe we could make a statue.
I quite like the idea that someone's like, what are we going to do with this manky big piece of rock that's sticking out? I've got an idea.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and funnily enough, actually, not to get to the conspiracy theories too early on in the pod, but there are other areas of the natural bedrock of the Giza Plateau which have weathered or sort of part weathered, partly been cut, and which now look a bit like a Sphinx, which has got the conspiracy theorists all jumping up and down because, maybe there's another Sphinx, and there's not. It's just a bit of rock that looks a bit like one.
I'm definitely coming back to conspiracy theories in a bit, though.
Okay.
And in terms of age, when are we talking about for the creation of the Sphinx originally?
So the conventional view is that it was cut during the reign of Pharaoh Khafra, who is a pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, the 4th in the sequence in the 4th dynasty, and he reigned somewhere around 2600, 2700 BC. So early on in dynastic Egyptian history, the reason I mentioned conspiracy theories is because it and indeed lots of the monuments at Giza are, unlike some monuments elsewhere in Egypt, not covered with inscriptions naming the person who was responsible for them. We're sort of not entirely short of inscriptions, but there just aren't that many. And this gives rise to questions over whether it was really built by Khafra, or whether in fact it was built slightly earlier by his predecessor Khufu, or whether, and the upper limit of the speculation is that it's maybe thousands of years older, but the consensus conventional view is that it's coming up to sort of 4,700 years old,
which is pretty old. I mean, it's an impressive thing
old, yeah,
to still be there as well. Do you have an idea that you could give us of its dimensions? So obviously in the game you can clamber all over it, but how big is it for someone who's never been to see it? Could you give us an idea of the scale?
It's the size of sort of the sides of it are the size of a 2 or 3 story building, and so if you found yourself on the back, you'd be like a little sort of ant running around rather than a human being, straddling the thing like you would ride a horse. It takes a good 5 or so minutes to walk around it. So when you get to walk around it, you see things, the hindquarters. I mean, nobody's top priority is to see the Sphinx's bum, but it is very interesting actually, and it is cut very beautifully actually. The body of the lion with its hind legs kind of tucked underneath it, and its tail, which is present, curled around the side of its body, around the right hand side of its body. It's easy to miss those things in just looking at the head and shoulders, basically, which is the much more famous part of it.
And do we have a sense of what it would have looked like when it was new? If we assume the conventional wisdom, it's about 4,500 years old and it was carved from the rock. Would it have been painted?
Yeah, good question. So yes, it would have been, and in fact there are traces of paint still on it. So I'm not sure to what extent those are visible when you visit, but if you can get up close enough, the flesh of the pharaoh's face is painted as you would expect, in a kind of sort of reddish brown colour, which is the convention in Egyptian art for human or male flesh, I should say. It's different for women. The Nemi's headdress, it seems, was painted as well. It did have a beard at one point, and fragments of that are here and there. You can go and see a chunk of that in the British Museum if you would like to. There was a uraeus, and then I suppose, as we mentioned at the start, the body is quite badly worn now, and it's been restored. So actually, if you look closely, it is a bit of a mishmash now of eroded limestone and then patches of limestone blocks. And I think we have to assume that originally it would have been cut smooth, but it would originally, I think, have been a kind of perfect looking thing, and painted, yes. And quite often it's not possible to be 100% confident of identifying a god or goddess on the basis of what they look like, or even on the basis of what they're doing. The clincher is the hieroglyphic inscription, and we don't have those in the case of the Sphinx. Or rather, we don't have inscriptions that are contemporaneous with its construction. What we do have is a little stela, which was erected over 1,000 years later and placed in between the paws, just in front of the kind of chest, if you like. And that refers to the Sphinx as being a composite solar deity. So in this case, it seems to represent some form of the sun god. But the other thing I suppose it's all about it is that it's without parallel. There's no other giant rock cut Sphinx like this anywhere else, and it's on its own as well. It's not one of a pair in this case. Although, as I mentioned, there are people that want to see funny lumps of rock as being second sphinxes at Giza. And that inscription on the stela in between the paws, as I mentioned, is from over 1,000 years later, so we can't be absolutely certain. The conception of what the Sphinx was in the New Kingdom in the time of Ptolemy IV was the same as it was at the time it was constructed. My hunch is that this was a roughly Sphinx-looking outcrop of rock at a certain point and got fashioned into this. On the one hand, you can try and read loads of meaning into that. I often think actually that there might have just been a bit more opportunism here, and it just looked cool, so they did it. And and then years later somebody goes, "Oh, it's the sun god."
So in Assassin's Creed, the Sphinx turns out to be a tomb that you can go into. Do we know if it's hollow? Was it ever designed to be a tomb?
There are cavities within it, but without any clear sort of explanation as to what they are. And some of those at least might have been natural fissures or voids in the rock. Giza is a cemetery, and there are certainly hundreds of tombs there, and indeed the pyramids were tombs, but the Sphinx itself, it seems to have been part of a plan to develop the landscape at Giza under Khafra, if we're right in thinking that. So Khafra has a pyramid, it's the middle one of the three main pyramids. That pyramid is connected to what we imaginatively call a pyramid temple, which is a little cult building directly next to the pyramid on the east side, on the east face. A causeway then leads down the plateau slopes downwards, eastwards towards the Nile, and at the base of that causeway is what we call a valley temple. That's part of the standard pyramid complex by this point. The Sphinx is sort of next to the bottom end of the causeway, and directly in front of it and directly next to the Valley Temple of Khafra is another temple which we call imaginatively the Sphinx Temple. And that all seems to have been part of a unity. So if that's right, then the Sphinx and its temple is connected to Khafra's burial place, cult place, all the buildings that were provided for his funeral and his afterlife. But other than that, the Sphinx itself is not a tomb, and in what way it's connected to Khafra's funerary cult is not clear.
So you've mentioned, I probably need to get into this idea that there are lots of theories about what it was. So it seems like you think it was kind of an opportunistic use of a lump of stone that was there and was almost the right shape anyway. But what are some of the kind of wilder theories about what it was and how it came to be there?
The one that is the go-to for everybody is that it is in some way connected with a lost hall of records, which is underneath the Sphinx, which preserves all the knowledge of a lost ancient civilization. I don't know a great deal about this, but there's a number of pseudo-archaeologists who want to believe that such a thing does exist, so that there was a much older civilization than ancient Egypt, which was very sophisticated and advanced and had lots of technology that subsequently became lost, and there was lots of had lots of knowledge, and that this was all set down somehow and preserved, and it happened to be preserved in this hall of records, this chamber which is in the Sphinx or under the Sphinx or something like that. And in fact it's this ancient civilization that was responsible for the construction of the Sphinx and the construction of the pyramids. So that's why I mentioned earlier that the age of the Sphinx is, for some people, is in doubt. Just to be absolutely clear, the archaeological evidence all points to it. The consensus view, the fourth dynasty, probably the time of Khafra, if not maybe one of his immediate predecessors or successors. So roughly 2,700 years ago.
But why let evidence get in the way of a really good story?
The thing with the Hall of Records thing is that it's always the wrong way of doing archaeology, of course, to have it in mind, have the thing that you want to find in mind and then look for that. Archaeology works the other way around. You go to the place and you see what's there and then you interpret it. And at Giza, an awful lot of seeing what's there has been done, and as boring as it might be for people who want a Hall of Records, it's not there.
If the Sphinx then was part of sort of a complex that maybe had some religious significance around the pyramids and lots of temples around it, when does it lose that and sort of become more of a tourist attraction?
Oh, that's a really great question. If we follow the consensus view, and the Sphinx and those pyramids are cut in the 4th dynasty as royal tombs and associated buildings, Giza, then you're absolutely right, has a life of its own that is still going. So that stela that I mentioned, for example, which is between the paws of the Sphinx, erected by Pharaoh Thutmose IV of the 18th dynasty, who reigned in something like 1400 BC, so well over 1,000 years after we think the pyramids were built. Basically what that stela says is it's a legitimizing tool for Thutmose IV, who we deduce must have had some reason for feeling threatened as pharaoh. And he tells us that he went to have a snooze by the Sphinx at a certain point, and the Sphinx was completely covered in sand at this point, or not, or almost. And the Sphinx visits him in a dream and says, "Look, mate, if you can just clear the sand from around me, then I'll make you king." And that's, hey presto, that's what happens. So he's the legitimate king. But of course, by the by, it shows us that the Sphinx had sanded up. I'm skipping through history very rapidly here, but you've got a whole spate of new tombs being cut around the causeway of Khafra and elsewhere in the 26th dynasty. So the site is still very much in use as a sacred space and as a cemetery site at this point. And of course, I suppose crucially at that time, religious beliefs are not the same, but it's still basically the same, paganism, the same pantheon of Egyptian gods. There is obviously a change at the point at which paganism is supplanted by Christianity in Egypt and then subsequently by Islam. But the pyramids and the Sphinx never stop being something that people want to go and see. So even when the site was still in use as a cemetery, a sacred place for the worship of the pagan gods, I think we can imagine that people might have gone there for those reasons, in order to be pious and religious.
It's almost like a pilgrimage site in ancient Egypt.
And certainly that even beyond the point at which they still hold any religious significance for people after paganism has died out, they do very much become something that people want to go and visit, and that's true of medieval Arab writers, and then in later times European and other visitors as well. I guess the crucial changeover point really is that point at which its religious significance alters. But I suspect that there's the idea of wanting to go and just gawp at them has never gone away.
Yeah, and I guess that continued finding of a reason to go there is part of the reason why they survived so well, because they might lose the immediate significance, the reason for which they're created, but they're still a thing to go and see, to blow your mind.
Yeah, that's true. That is true, and yet, although it is the case that monuments get dismantled from time to time, not the pyramids. So sometimes monuments get dismantled in places where, let's say, sort of in a sacred space where the area in which you can build is very restricted. So if you want to build a temple and there's already a temple in the way, or there's not enough space, then you might dismantle somebody's temple and build your own. Sometimes they were recycling stone. But I guess the main reason why the Great Pyramid is never dismantled is that it would have just been too difficult. Apart from anything else, there might have been somebody saying, hey, let's not dismantle that because, good money for the locals in terms of tourism and that sort of thing. Undoubtedly, I sound like I'm joking, but that would undoubtedly have been true. But more than anything else, I think it would have just been too difficult. Some those blocks would just be too difficult to move. And the Giza pyramids are so solidly built, they haven't really needed any help to survive. And it's worth pointing out as well that the outermost layer of stones were removed, and so we're told partly used for the construction of medieval Cairo. So whoever was doing that certainly didn't care that the outer casing was coming off. They just wanted the building materials, but they obviously didn't go further. And like I say, my guess would be maybe there was some sort of pride in it, or some sense that these are too important. But I suspect it might also just be that it's just too difficult.
Yeah, so if you want to be remembered for eternity, just build a monument that's far too difficult for anyone to get rid of.
Yes, exactly, yes.
So there's a story that the Sphinx has no nose because of Napoleon. Is there any truth in that, or is that up with Napoleon firing his cannons at the pyramids as not quite true?
There is no truth in it. Fortunately, because some of those travellers we're talking about who visited Egypt to go and see the sites, and did so before Napoleon's armies arrived, made drawings of the Sphinx, and although they are of sort of varying degrees of accuracy and realism, they make it very clear that the nose was missing before that point. So it's it's not a very nice story. It's an unpleasant story, but it's not true.
And before we finish, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, so during lockdown, during the pandemic, you used Assassin's Creed as part of a project called Playing in the Past. Can you just tell us a little bit about that and why you did that? Yeah,
gosh, that was unexpected and extraordinary experience. Essentially, I was writing a book about Cleopatra, a book for children, and needed some visual references for what Alexandria would have looked like. Most of the story of Cleopatra on the Egyptian side, anyway, is set in Alexandria. And we know a certain amount about Alexandria and its buildings, and can imagine what it might look like. And I'd done enough digging around by this point to know that there was a discovery tour a sort of version of the game or a part of the game where you don't actually have to do the game playing. You can just walk around the environment. I thought, wow, this sounds amazing. I'd love to do this because I could just run around and not have to worry about being shot or killed. And it's amazing. I absolutely loved it. And I got to know that obviously Ubisoft really do their research and had a team dedicated to making sure that everything you see as far as possible is based on whatever evidence we have available, whether that's archaeology or descriptions from writers like Strabo, who left quite a comprehensive description of Alexandria. So little of the archaeology survives. So, we're really dependent on Strabo's descriptions. So for the team at Ubisoft to have gone to the lengths they did to recreate that environment and do it in such an immersive way is really invaluable. They've paid so much attention to how those places would have looked at a specific moment in time in the late Ptolemaic, and the little details, it's really great. And you can, and I did when I was giving presentations on this during the project, you can put photographs of what remains of these monuments side by side with screenshots from the game, and you can totally see how they line up. I found it very exciting.
You can listen to the full interview about the Sphinx and what you can find in its posterior by clicking on the link in the description to listen to the Echoes of History podcast, or follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Hello, Lloyd. Welcome to Echoes of History. It's fantastic to have you here with us.
Thank you, Matt. It's a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'm really interested to find out more about Ptolemy XIII, because I think in the midst of all of the Egyptian stuff that everybody knows about, Ptolemy kind of slips through the gaps a little bit. He's not one of the better known figures from this period.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, by and large, he's a victim of circumstance because, of course, he ultimately lost in the civil war against Caesar and Cleopatra. Then, of course, he gets bad press in Julius Caesar's own written account of the Alexandrian War, and consequently over the ages, he's kind of been dismissed therefore as a kind of also-ran and unlucky in all ways. So it's really quite nice that you're giving him, a little bit of a 5 minutes of glory just for him to reclaim his crown again, because we don't know a great deal about him, but we know enough to get some sense of what he was about. There's not a full biography to be written of him, but he's worthy of being known about, certainly.
So Ptolemy XIII, his full name is Ptolemy Philopator, which doesn't sound like a very Egyptian name. So where do the Ptolemies come from?
Well, of course, the Ptolemies had been ruling in Egypt for almost 280 years at this point. They were, in fact, the longest ruling dynasty in Egypt's history, believe it or not. And of course, they descended from Ptolemy I, who was a general of Alexander the Great. And throughout this almost 300-year period, the Ptolemies had been assiduously working themselves into the Egyptian system. So they were kind of sort of projecting a bilingual sense of who they were, both appealing to their Greek subjects, who were mainly based in the Delta and in Alexandria, but also, of course, to their Egyptian subjects as well. It was Ptolemy's sister, Cleopatra VII, who actually was a master at doing this. I mean, she was the only Ptolemy ever to learn to speak Egyptian, for instance. All the other Ptolemies, all the other rulers, only spoke Greek. That was their native language, and that was their administrative language as well. It was rather like, the sort of colonial imposition of Britain on, say, India in the 19th century. The bureaucracy of state was in the language of the ruler, so English or Greek in this particular case. So it's no surprise really that Ptolemy XIII gets this Greek title, his full sort of name, which means, of course, he is a god, Theos, and he is father-loving. The father-loving god is his name. And he was the son of Ptolemy XII, a man who's come down to us by the name of Fluter, Auletes, because he was a good flute player, and maybe he should have stuck to flute playing, not really to governance, because he wasn't a very good politician. During Ptolemy XII's reign, which lasted for about 14-15 years, he very conscientiously and carefully persuaded the Romans to keep him on the Egyptian throne, and he paid a fortune out to various Roman senators, basically to back his claim to the Egyptian throne. So by the time Ptolemy XII died, Egypt was forking out an enormous amount of revenue to the Romans. In fact, it's been estimated that Ptolemy XII, in just a few years, paid the entire year's revenue that the Egyptians were earning to Roman senators. So he was tying himself closer and closer to Roman power. Of course, Ptolemy XII realized that Rome was in the ascendancy. This was going to be, the real superpower in the Mediterranean. And he realized, that there's safety really in Rome's backing. But at the same time, of course, he was getting into bed with a very powerful neighbor who really controlled Egypt thereafter. And we really see this come to a head when Ptolemy XII wrote his will. And he left his will in the hands of none other than Pompey the Great, who he had paid off a considerable amount of money for Pompey's backing. And the will stated that upon Ptolemy XII's death, the throne should pass to his eldest daughter, Cleopatra VII, and to his eldest son, Ptolemy XIII, and they should be married together, brother-sister marriage. This is a very old tradition within the Ptolemaic royal house. It was considered absolutely proper for brothers and sisters to marry, to keep the blood pure, and also, of course, to promote the pharaoh and the queen as gods on earth as well. Isis and Osiris, the Egyptian gods, were of course brother and sister, husband, wife. Zeus and Hera in the Greek pantheon were brother, sister, husband and wife. And so the Ptolemies also took up this tradition. And really things would have been kind of normal in that relationship with Cleopatra marrying Ptolemy XIII, had Cleopatra herself not seemed to have balked at the idea. And we don't know why. It's really strange, because in the long history of the Cleopatras, who had ruled Egypt for 150 years alongside their brother Ptolemies, and I've just written a big book about this called The Cleopatras, it was absolutely standard for these women to marry their brothers. But for some reason, Cleopatra VII, the last Cleopatra, seems to buck that trend. She doesn't seem to want to. And we get a picture of this very, very early on after the death of Ptolemy XII, that she begins to promote herself as the sole ruler of Egypt, completely ignoring her father's will to have her younger brother on the throne with her. And that's very, very strange that she decides to do that.
I guess we should probably say Cleopatra VII is what we usually think of as the Cleopatra.
That's right, that's the Cleopatra. That's the Liz Taylor Cleopatra, right? So
yeah,
absolutely.
But everyone just forgets the 6 before her.
Exactly.
And so Ptolemy XIII, so to get to 13 Ptolemies and be the longest reigning dynasty would suggest that they're a fairly stable bunch, that they're doing a pretty good job. Would that be fair, or is
no,
just getting to 13 belie something?
No, the success of the dynasty belies the fact that underneath there was a lot of discontent. Particularly, there was this rift between the kind of Greek-speaking heart of Egypt, which was in the Nile Delta in the north, looking out to the Mediterranean, and especially in the capital city of Alexandria, and then south in what we call the Thebaid, that is today around the area of Luxor, Aswan, in Upper Egypt in the south. That was a real Egyptian heartland, and the Ptolemies really never quite got a complete foothold in the south, and there were rebellions throughout the Ptolemaic period trying to throw these Macedonians out of Greece. And even as late as the reign of Cleopatra VII, Ptolemy XIII, these rebellions are still bubbling away, on a small scale, but there's never really any guarantee of a holistic peace in Egypt at all. They get by, the Ptolemies do, certainly, but it's not an easy ride for them. And in the wider world, of course, They've also got their Seleucid cousins in Syria, who have been very, very troublesome for several hundred years. They really come to a swift end in the 60s BCE, so just before our period starts, when Syria becomes a Roman province. Cyrenaica in North Africa becomes a Roman province in the 60s BC as well. So Egypt finds itself now not only with a troublesome population, but also with neighbours on both land borders who are now Romans. And that's a big sea change for the Egyptians at this point. The gap of ages, I suppose, between Cleopatra and her brother would have been about 7 years. And I guess this is quite significant. Cleopatra must have been about 17 or 18 at the time of her father's death, which means that Ptolemy XIII can only be 9 or 10 at the most. And of course, within any regnal system, I mean, that is quite a difference, quite a significant difference in ability for a ruler. So while Cleopatra had the nonce and some of the experience to govern on her own, certainly Ptolemy XIII didn't. And probably at that point as well, he hadn't even begun to build for himself at court a reliable faction that he could draw on, a set of governors and councillors that could be of aid to him.
What kind of sources do we have then for Ptolemy XIII's life? If he is being squeezed out to the margins a little bit, how much reliable evidence do we have for his story?
Well, of course, when it comes to reliable evidence, not a great deal. I mean, we have Julius Caesar's own accounts, we have Plutarch, and we have Cassius Dio who write about him. But this is always in hindsight and with a narrative structure which just simply wants to get rid of him, really, In Julius Caesar's own account, for instance, of the Alexandrian War, he says that Ptolemy III surrounded himself with a group of untrustworthy councillors who disliked the idea of being ruled by a woman. That's such a Roman point of view to put forward. I doubt very much, really, if it was the feeling of these Ptolemaic councillors. So if we really want to get a handle on Ptolemy XIII himself, we have to go and look at the Egyptian sources. And although they're not plentiful, there are enough to steer us a little way into what occurred around about 50 BCE, when Ptolemy is obviously finding his feet within the court and finding a voice within the royal council as well. It's around 50 into 49 BC, for instance, that we get the first Egyptian evidence, demotic texts, very dry tax reports, in which Ptolemy's name appears in front of his sister Cleopatra. And that is very significant because precedence is everything in Egypt. Egypt is a very hierarchical society. So while Cleopatra is named, not called his wife, called his sister, Ptolemy takes precedence. And we also know that in late 50, early 49 BCE, there was a terrible famine in southern Egypt. And because the grain was not being exported north into Alexandria, the city of Alexandria was in danger of starvation. And we get a decree written in the name of Ptolemy XIII, ordering merchants to divert their grain imports to the city of Alexandria, to go into huge magazines, into huge sort of storage areas, so that the people of Alexandria can be fed. And that's a dictum signed and dated, as it were, by Ptolemy XIII himself. So it shows that he's getting active, and also, in crossing the T's and dotting the I's kind of bureaucracy there. Whether he's doing it himself or whether he's getting his councillors probably to do it is by the by, really. The importance is that he is quite clearly taking control of governmental aspects of Egypt. How Cleopatra VII acts to this is difficult to know, of course, because we don't have balancing evidence to say that what she was doing at the time.
And so as Ptolemy begins to take a bit more power and authority for himself, could you explain to us a little bit about what the role and the powers of the pharaoh precisely was? What would a pharaoh be doing? Kind of what were their day-to-day responsibilities? And were there any limits on their power and authority in Egypt?
Well, the pharaoh was there, first of all, in a religious role. He was a living god, and the Ptolemies really endorsed this idea. So both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII were considered to be gods incarnate on earth. And to that end, both the king and the queen were responsible for the running of the whole cosmos. And to do this, of course, they were appointed the chief priests of Egypt. And while they didn't necessarily conduct religious ceremonies themselves, by proxy, they were really the greatest religious authorities in Egypt. We don't see them operating in that way so much in the Ptolemaic period because we have more documentation which is about the kind of bureaucratic and administrative roles of pharaohs and queens at this point. And so we can see them very active in the day-to-day governance of Egypt. But we also do see those ceremonial moments where they have to play an important role too. We have no evidence of Ptolemy XIII ever leaving Alexandria, not even to go to Memphis, which was the old religious capital of Egypt near modern-day Cairo. So he seems to have been very orientated towards the north of Egypt, looking out towards the Mediterranean, maybe because of his youth and maybe because he doesn't have the right kind of counsel at this point. We can't be certain. But he doesn't play the political game in the way that Cleopatra VII does.
And in Assassin's Creed Origins, in the game, he's kind of portrayed as very much a puppet king. Is that fair? Is that reasonable?
Well, this is what comes over in the classical accounts. And again, we have to take this with a pinch of salt, of course. But in the classical accounts, he is ruled really by this powerful courtier named Ptolemy, who is a eunuch. Now that in itself, of course, while perfectly normal within a Hellenistic Egyptian context, eunuchs were part of the Egyptian court since the beginning of the Ptolemaic period. They'd been part of the court societies of the Near East for centuries and centuries. However, Romans find eunuchism, castration of men, abnormal, abhorrent. And so just the very fact that Julius Caesar writes, very clearly that this Ptolemy is a eunuch brings a lot of pejorative judgments with it straight away anyway. And so, Ptolemy is crafted really. I always think of him like in Disney's Aladdin. He's like a Jafar character, He sort of looms over this boy king and the boy has no power himself. He's almost kind of Svengali hold over Ptolemy, virtually hypnotic in the way that he controls this. But we have to be very, very careful about that. It gives Ptolemy XIII no sense of presence, of ability, or of authority of any kind. We hear also of two others. We have Theodotus, who's his tutor. We have also a man called Achilles, Ptolemy's chief general. And again, they are portrayed as incompetent tutors and incompetent military men at best. But this is very much the Roman and then the later Plutarchian play on this period. And I wouldn't really want to put so very much trust in it as, for instance, filmmakers have done. And I don't think that's quite the Ptolemy XIII that comes over in those fragments of Egyptian evidence that we have, where we see him actually active in the bureaucracy.
Do we know anything about what Ptolemy XIII looked like? Because obviously in the game they have to present us with an image of him, and he is there as this kind of fairly immature young man, and he's depicted wearing the pharaonic headdress, the nemes. Do we have any idea of whether that might be what he would have presented like?
We have no reliable image of Ptolemy XIII, although we do have a series of sculpted pharaonic-style portraits of young, unidentified kings or princes from this period. They have been either labelled as Caesarian, Cleopatra VII's son by Julius Caesar, or unidentified prince. So there's a possibility that these youthful statues could represent Ptolemy XIII. But we certainly know that the Ptolemies and the Cleopatras did not go around dressed as characters from Aida on a day-to-day basis. They were Greeks and they wore Greek clothing. When they presented themselves to their Egyptian subjects as living gods, of course they would almost put on like fancy dress, essentially, to perform that kind of role. But we have to get out of our heads this whole myth that they went around looking like New Kingdom pharaohs, like Tutankhamun. That's absolutely not the way. And in fact, the hallmark of monarchy in Ptolemaic Egypt was not anything like the Nemes headcloth or the urei, the cobras. It was the simple diadem, which is just a strip of white linen which was tied around the head into a knot at the nape of the neck. And that actually was the most powerful image of monarchy that you had in the Hellenistic world.
Interesting. So we need to think of them dressing more as Greeks and maybe just cosplaying Egyptian for special occasions.
Absolutely. That's exactly it.
Does Ptolemy XIII then have any kind of a legacy in the story, or is he simply someone who never quite reached the point at which they were going to make an impact and fulfill their potential?
Yeah, he never makes his impact at all. And he serves really as a weak character in this narrative. You know, he is the annoying stepbrother kind of figure, or half-brother, or whatever you want to call him. And in a way, the historical Ptolemy XIII has ceased to matter. And what has become important, of course, is the kind of narrative figure, the character that he is forced to play in the many, many narrated versions we have of the Caesar Cleopatra story, and very little else.
Oh, welcome to Echoes of History, Jen. It's fantastic to have you here.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here.
So to get us started, could you give us a little bit of context about kind of what's going on here? We're talking about the Alexandrian War. As a medieval historian, I might be thinking of Alexander the Great. I don't know. I don't even know what this is. I'm looking forward to finding out more.
Great. Well, so Alexander the Great is the founder of the city of Alexandria. It's a great port city in Egypt. And Caesar did not mean to walk into a war there. It's actually sort of a chain of unrelated events that brings him to Egypt in the first place. He has been involved in a civil war with Pompey, who is one of the other kind of great warlords of the end of the Roman Republic. And after the battle at Pharsalus, Pompey fled to Alexandria. He had a pre-existing relationship with Ptolemy XII, who was the previous ruler of Alexandria. And so he thought, okay, I've just been defeated by Caesar, but I've got these allies here. Maybe I can go get some ships, get some money, get this civil war going again. He arrives in Alexandria and is immediately beheaded in the harbor because they have
What a reception.
Yeah, it's quite a welcome. His family is in the boat watching when it happens. It's actually a very gruesome episode. But the current ruler of Alexandria, Ptolemy XIII, he knows that Caesar won the war, and he doesn't want to attach himself to a loser. And so Pompey is executed. Caesar is in pursuit, arrives there about 3 days later, and that's how he ends up in Alexandria to begin with, surprises Ptolemy by not thanking him and celebrating the death of his rival and his enemy. Our sources are unanimous about his reaction, that he said, "No, this was a consul of Rome. This was my son-in-law." He had been married to Caesar's daughter for a time. And in fact, young Ptolemy, I'm not very happy with you. And I hear that you and your sister are fighting about the throne. This is how he becomes involved in the conflict in Alexandria.
Would beheading an enemy like that have been acceptable in an Egyptian context? Might Ptolemy have thought he was doing the right thing and that Caesar might have thanked him, but actually what Caesar sees is an Egyptian person killing a significant Roman individual, and that's just not on?
Yeah, it's certainly, he thought that it would be taken as a sign of respect, a sign of friendship. What he didn't understand was Caesar's sort of military and political philosophy of what we call in the Latin clementia. It's exactly what it sounds like in English. This policy of clemency or mercy. Caesar had a very strong policy of pardoning his enemies. This was not a humanitarian gesture. I don't want to give that impression that he's like, hey, I just want us to be Roman buddies again. Very, very pragmatic, right? Like, if you owe Caesar your life, you are in his debt. And so he made people useful this way. He very much wanted the opportunity to be seen pardoning Pompey. and to put Pompey in his debt. So yeah, it was not just the gruesomeness of the execution, but the fact that it robbed Caesar of the symbolic victory to go along with his actual military victory.
Yeah, and I suppose as well, it gave Caesar the space to think of it as almost an attack on Rome as well, which he would see as unacceptable too.
Yes, whether he genuinely saw it that way or not, that's absolutely how he frames it. And that is part of his justification for entering into the war in Alexandria, is to treat it as an attack on the friendship between the Romans and the Alexandrians, which dates back quite a few generations at that point.
So before we get into too much detail about the actual war, could we talk a little bit about Alexandria, the city? Kind of where is it in modern day Egypt? And do we know what Alexandria looked like?
Yeah, great question. So it's underneath modern Alexandria. So it's exactly the site that the modern city is on, founded at the end of the 4th century by Alexander. In his campaigns, he traveled to Egypt, decided that he was the son of Zeus Ammon, an Egyptian god, and thought
As you do.
Yeah, I mean, it's when in Rome or when in Egypt, I guess. And so Alexandria is just a marvelously cosmopolitan city. It was, the term melting pot is kind of overused, but it was very much a melting pot of the native Egyptian population, of course, but also this Macedonian Greek population that Alexander sort of imported. So you end up with a sort of triangulation between the Egyptian people, who are not exclusively the lower classes, but much of the economically lower class population. You have the Egyptian priestly elite, and then you have the Ptolemies, these Greek rulers who have been imposed. And so they negotiate something of a détente in which the priests are allowed to maintain religious authority, the Ptolemies political, economic, military authority. And so what grows up is just an incredibly vibrant and diverse city, becomes home to a really important cultural institution, the Library of Alexandria, which it was a library. They had books there. They tried to get a copy of every book written in Greek and eventually in Latin. But it was also kind of like a modern university. It was a place where scholars would come, research, pursue their own scholarly pursuits, using funding from the Ptolemies and then to the benefit of the Ptolemies, right? This like royal patronage system. And so we get some incredible advances in literature, science, mathematics, medicine, all taking place there, what we might today call a global city. One of the great sort of physical landmarks on the Alexandrian landscape is the Pharos Lighthouse. This is one of the original 7 wonders of the world. We have no direct evidence, physical evidence of it. That's quite long gone. I believe as late as maybe the 15th century, there were still at least some bricks and rubble from it. But when it was constructed, it was sort of the most magnificent thing that had, ever been seen, protecting this very important harbor. I don't know as much about the folks who are doing underwater archaeology there. That's just a huge emerging field. But I believe they have done a lot to kind of reconstruct the 2 main harbors kind of on other side of the Pharos Causeway. But yeah, the harbor area would have been incredibly well developed because this is really kind of your central point for any sort of water transport. It's hard to get a really good look at Alexandria because, as I mentioned, the modern city is right on top of it in such a way that it would be very disruptive to dig underneath. But there are great people doing amazing excavations there.
Yeah, very inconsiderate to build a new city on top of the old city.
I mean, honestly, just, find another spot. No, I'm kidding.
have a bit of consideration. So we've heard a couple of names already that people I think will recognise. We've talked a bit about Julius Caesar. We've talked about Cleopatra. We've heard kind of Ptolemy XIII. Are there any other kind of main players involved as we move into this period? And how are they all aligned? Who's on whose side?
Yeah, so the Ptolemies are always going to give you a very complicated family dynamic. There's Can't talk about Ptolemies without talking about incest. It's just part of the game, these sort of royal marriages. So we've got 4 siblings who are in play here. We've mentioned the 2 elder siblings. Ptolemy XIII is on the throne. He's supposed to be sharing it with his sister Cleopatra VII. And of course, this is our famous Cleopatra. They have 2 younger siblings who are going to become involved. There's Ptolemy XIV. And then they have a sister named Arsinoe who is going to get involved in the war. And she has kind of an interesting storyline as well. And I think the other 2 people that are good to be aware of, Ptolemy XIII is a teenager at this point. So he is technically ruling, but he does have a regent who has been appointed to rule alongside him. And this is a eunuch named Pothinus, who seems to have been very ambitious for himself. There's also the head of the armed forces named Achilles. He's also going to be involved in the conflict that ensues. There are no sides except Caesar and Cleopatra kind of end up on a side together, but everyone else is just out for their own personal advancement.
Yeah, and I guess this takes sibling rivalry to a whole new level to marry your sibling and then fall out so spectacularly.
Yeah, it really complicates the holidays. It's really stressful.
Be a fly on the wall in one of those awkward family dinners. So Caesar kind of marches into the middle of all of this that's already going on, this dynamic between the Ptolemies in Egypt. We haven't quite mentioned kind of when he arrived. So when are we, and how does his arrival, so we've heard he's not very happy about what happens to Pompey. When does he arrive, and how does that reaction of his turn into war?
Yeah, so it's 48 BCE is the year that we are in. He'll be there from 48 until 47, so a little bit around a year, give or take. The reception in the city is mixed. The idea of Roman occupation is something that provokes a lot of anxiety in any part of the Mediterranean world that has not yet been subjugated by the Romans. Egypt at this point is one of the last sort of free independent kingdoms that is directly in the orbit of the Romans. It's not going to become a province until Cleopatra has died. But among at least the ruling elite, this cabal around Ptolemy XIII, they're quite excited when he gets there because they think they're going to attach themselves to the new master of Rome. When they see that that's not the case, they are going to begin to prepare for war and besiege him. So it's a pretty quick change of attitude, which is something that our sources have a little bit to say about. We have a record of the war in Alexandria that was written by somebody who was there. We don't know who wrote it. It was certainly one of Caesar's officers that wrote it, but we don't know which one. But anyhow, this author makes a point to say, well, the Egyptians, they welcomed us at first, but then they turned on us because that's what Egyptians are like. They're shifty, they're disloyal. And so the way that our Roman sources present it, that's the reason that Caesar's reception changes so drastically, is it's totally about the character of the Egyptian people. Unfortunately, we don't have sources from the other side, so all we have is kind of this very xenophobic Roman interpretation.
And so then it also seems quite odd that Caesar ends up in Alexandria, kind of the capital of Egypt, and then he is besieged within the city. They lay siege to him within their own capital city. That seems slightly odd. How does he end up being trapped and besieged in Alexandria?
Yeah, so Caesar didn't come to Egypt looking for a war. He didn't pack for that. So he has come not prepared to engage in any sort of warfare. And the Ptolemaic army is quite capable. The Ptolemies have never really sought to expand their kingdom, but they have been in nearly constant wars of defense around their borders. So kind of beating back the Seleucids, the Antigonids from the Macedonian dynasty. So even though they have never tried to invade mainland Europe or anything like that, they do have like very capable forces. And so it happens sort of before Caesar can even react. He is going to get penned in there. He does send for reinforcements. That's what ultimately is going to turn the tide of the siege. He's going to get this guy Mithridates, and then the kingdom of the Jews are going to send some reinforcements. But until then, he's really at just an incredible numbers disadvantage. But it is, you're right, it's unusual to have somebody besieged not in their own home city. That is part of the advantage of linking up with Cleopatra. He never would have survived without being able to call upon her resources and her local knowledge.
Yeah, and also quite surprising, I guess, that we think of Caesar as one of the great generals of the ancient world, and here there's some teenager from Alexandria has got the drop on him. While he's unpacking his sandals and his towels and looking for a sunbed, he's suddenly besieged in the city by a teenage boy. That must have been a bit of a slap in the face for Caesar too.
It is, and I think this is a lot of why the historical record does not have a ton to say about this conflict. So we have the document I mentioned, the Alexandrian War history, written by someone who is there. It is very clearly written as a sort of apologetic, making it sound like it wasn't as bad as it was. That every time he describes an Alexandrian advantage, so they win a sea battle, they retake part of the city, he's going to follow that up with, but all that did was make Caesar's men fight harder. So he's working overtime to make this seem like it wasn't a near catastrophe. It absolutely was. I don't think we really can even access how difficult Caesar's position was because our sources don't want to give us that. Our best later sources for this we have two biographies of Caesar by Suetonius and Plutarch. They're really going to kind of downplay how close to disaster he came. There's also a historian named Cassius Dio. He's a little bit more balanced, but he's so much later that we don't know what he's basing his history on. So yeah, for someone who is even today regarded as one of the greatest military geniuses of all time, he came perilously close to not making it out of Alexandria.
Yeah, so maybe not a surprise that Rome doesn't broadcast this massive issue that they've had with this teenage boy in Egypt.
Yeah, that's one that you're gonna maybe try to relegate to a footnote if you can.
Yeah. We can say it was difficult, so Caesar looks good, but we don't want to say it was actually really quite scary.
It is. Well, that's why Caesar does it himself. He leaves nothing to chance regarding the Gallic War and the Civil War. We still possess today, and that's a lot of what my research is on these narratives that he wrote about his own wars, precisely to take that opportunity away from posterity. He really wanted to control that narrative. I think Caesar would have been tremendously successful in today's media ecosystem. He would not need a social media team. He would know exactly how to pitch his message. He was quite
born
savvy.
Influencer.
Yeah.
How does the siege play out then? Do we get a series of kind of battles and a bit of to and fro? Does it look at any point? I mean, you said it seems at some points that maybe Rome might have lost, Caesar might have lost this, but how does it actually play out?
Yeah, so again, according to this anonymous officer who was there were a series of naval battles. It was largely fought within the harbors for control of the harbor, very back and forth. The Alexandrians would win one, and then the Romans would be so inspired, motivated, they would win another. One advantage that the Egyptians had is they were able to increase the size of their fleet very rapidly. Obviously, Caesar can't be building new ships when he's trapped in the palace, but the Egyptians are able to kind of constantly refresh their supply of ships and sailors. This is the point at which the library of Alexandria was pretty famously set on fire, and much of what was contained there of literature, scientific resources was lost. One of the ways that you sort of do naval warfare at this point is you try to burn each other's ships. And in an ancient city, there's a lot of flammable material. So at some point, a fire that Caesar's men set kind of took off from the ships into the harbor and burned down the library. And this, of course, played right into the narrative of Ptolemy, who could then say, the Romans, these savage, barbarous Romans, have now tried to take away the great cultural achievement of our city. But anyhow, so lots of sea battles. The climactic battle of the conflict is in the delta of the Nile River, kind of in the mouth there. In this battle, Ptolemy himself gets kind of backed into a corner. He jumps off his boat to try to swim to safety, and he drowns in the river. And this is largely what changes the momentum of the war. By this point, Caesar's reinforcements have arrived, and he's able to be freed at that point.
And so does the loss of Ptolemy kind of almost end it in the sense that both Caesar has reinforcements coming, but he also has Cleopatra on his side at this point? So he already has the Queen of Egypt. So with the king gone, does all of that kind of come together to mean that Caesar just wins? Does it just fizzle out?
Very much so, right? Like, they've lost their leadership on that side. I should say that Arsinoe, the sister, is also kind of out there. She has her own troops around her and is trying to kind of wedge into this conflict. Her troops get defeated as well. So yes, Cleopatra is really the only plausible leader to install at this point. So it is in some ways kind of a default at that point.
What does Caesar do once the siege of Alexandria is over?
Yeah, so once he is freed from the siege, he places on the throne, through what authority, don't ask me, because at this point, Rome is not in control of Egypt. It's not a province, but sort of through his, what the Romans called auctoritas, his personal authority, installs Cleopatra, and then the little brother, who we had kind of forgotten about, marries them off to each other, makes them king and queen of Egypt, and then he's going to go off to Asia Minor, where Pharnaces, who is a king over there, has been sort of annoying the Romans for a while. So he's going to install Cleopatra and little bro, and then he's going to head off to the east to continue his warmongering.
And I think outside of Assassin's Creed Origins, which is kind of set during this Alexandrian War, and then the 1963 famous Cleopatra film, which also features the Alexandrian War, it's not something that gets talked about too much. It hasn't made it into pop culture in the same way as, you know, we all know about Antony and Cleopatra, and we all know about Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, and we all know about those names that revolve around it, and maybe that's some of the fallout of it. Why do you think we know so little about it? Is it because Rome came so close to losing there that they didn't want it particularly well recorded?
I do think that has a lot to do with it. What we conceive the ancient world as looking like is so dependent on what was handed down to us. In the same way, like, yes, Caesar was the victor here, but this was not a glorious victory. And so right away in the, immediate aftermath, when the sort of apologetic text by the officer was written, and then the next couple generations, it didn't contribute to the myth of Roman greatness in a very useful way. And that gets repeated through the years. And so by the time we get to us in the 20th century, it's been, if not fully elided from the record, which, it hasn't been, it's been smoothed over and whitewashed so much. I don't think there's anything here for creative people to kind of latch on to. I think the other thing that is sort of at play here is that the only person in all of history who's big enough to overshadow Caesar is Cleopatra. And so I think when you have them together in the story, it's the Cleopatra side of it that interests people more. So maybe people don't know about the battles that took place, but they might have heard the story about how they met, that she was snuck into the palace wrapped up in tapestries, because she's just such a big character. And so I think that's part of how Caesar gets kind of elided from his own story here. And that means it doesn't have a place in Roman history to the Romans themselves.
Thanks for watching Echoes of History. If you've enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the real history behind the Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe for more episodes. You can check out the extended interviews wherever you get your podcasts by clicking the link in the description. And click on whatever links might be on the screen to watch me do some weird medieval stuff, I guess.